Gus Svensson had seen 50 Alaska winters. He told Walter Korhonen the math was brutal and simple. A metal Quonset hut needed 15 cords of firewood to survive the cold. Walter could produce 4. Every year someone comes up here with a clever idea, Svensson said. Every year I sell supplies to the rescue party that goes looking for the bodies. That January, the temperature dropped to 52 below zero. 3 homesteaders died in the cold. Tom Hendricks nearly froze trying to reach more fuel. But inside his metal shed, Walter Korhonen's children slept through the night. Their floor cool instead of frozen, the air 90 degrees warmer than the killing cold outside. Svensson had been wrong. This is how. The thermometer read 18 degrees above zero inside the Quonset hut. Outside, the air had dropped to 62 below. Walter Korhonen held his hand flat against the floor, the same floor that should have been frozen solid, that should have been sucking heat from his children's bodies as they slept. The wood felt cool, not cold, not the bone-deep freeze that killed, just cool, like autumn, like a root cellar in Michigan where he'd grown up. 90 degrees of difference. Between life out here and death out there, 90 degrees. Through the small window crusted with ice on the outside, Walter could see nothing. Ice fog had swallowed the world. Somewhere out there, 2 miles to the east, the Hendricks family was burning through their woodpile at 3 times the normal rate. Their floor would be frozen. Their children would be sleeping in shifts to keep the fire alive. But in Walter's metal cabin, the one everyone said would be a death trap, the one old Gus Svensson had called a tin can coffin, his family slept. All of them. Through the night. The stove ticked and settled. The stone foundation he'd spent 2 months building held the earth's warmth like a secret. It was working. 8 months earlier, when Walter had announced his building plan to the men gathered at Svensson's general store, not a single person had believed he would survive his first winter. They'd called it the dumbest idea they'd ever heard. A metal shed on stilts, wrapped in a skirt of river stones, as if rocks could keep a family warm when the air turned to knives. Now the temperature outside was cold enough to freeze a man's lungs in 3 breaths, and Walter's children were sleeping. This is the story of how a crippled veteran, a pile of surplus military junk, and 16 tons of creekstone kept a family alive when the world tried to kill them. But to understand how Walter Korhonen beat the Alaska winter, you have to go back to the beginning, to a day in May when a man with a bad leg, $400, and 2 small children stepped off a boat in Seward and looked north toward land that would either make him or bury him. He had 5 months to figure out which. The truck died 6 miles from the homestead claim. Walter stood in the mud of what Alaskans generously called a road and listened to the engine click and ping as it cooled. His left leg throbbed. The shrapnel fragments buried near his knee always ached after a long drive, and he'd been driving for 3 days. First the ferry from Seward, then the rough track along the inlet, and now this. Stuck on a logging trail in the middle of nowhere with a wife, 2 children, and everything they owned in the bed of a surplus army truck that had just given up. Elsa climbed out of the cab, holding 4-year-old Eric on her hip. 7-year-old Anna followed, her eyes wide as she took in the wall of spruce forest pressing in from both sides of the trail. "How far?" Elsa asked. 6 miles, maybe 7. She didn't ask the other questions, the ones about what they would do if the truck couldn't be fixed, or how they would move their supplies, or whether this had all been a terrible mistake. Those questions hung in the air like the mosquitoes already beginning to find them, but Elsa had learned during 4 years of marriage that asking them wouldn't produce answers. Walter limped to the front of the truck and opened the hood. The smell of burned oil rose to meet him. Behind him, Anna asked the question her mother wouldn't. "Papa, are we going to die out here?" Walter didn't turn around. "No," he said, "we're not." He didn't know yet if that was true. 3 weeks later, after a borrowed mule had hauled their supplies the final 6 miles, after Walter had traded 2 days of fence labor for a tow back to Kenai and a new fuel pump, the Korhonen stood on their 160 acres and faced the math of survival. The homestead claim sat on a gentle rise above a creek, surrounded by mixed spruce and birch forest, good timber, good water, good soil where the muskeg didn't dominate. By the standards of Alaska homesteading, it was a reasonable piece of land, but reasonable didn't mean survivable. Walter had already done the calculations. He'd done them on the ferry, done them again in the truck, done them every night since they'd arrived. The numbers never changed, and they never got better. An Alaska winter required heat. Heat required fuel. Fuel meant firewood, cords of it, stacked and seasoned and ready to burn. 1 cord of wood was a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. 128 cubic feet of timber, roughly 2 tons of weight. In Michigan, a cord might last a month. In Alaska, during the coldest stretches, a family could burn a cord in 2 weeks. The standard wisdom said 7 cords minimum for a winter, 10 to be safe, 12 if you were heating a poorly insulated structure. And that was the problem. The only structure Walter could afford, the only one he had time to build, was a surplus Quonset hut he'd bought for $800 from the War Assets Administration. 20 feet wide, 48 feet long, corrugated steel walls curving up to form the roof. No insulation, no thermal, mass. Just a thin shell of metal between his family and the cold. Metal conducted heat like a wire conducted electricity. It would suck warmth from the interior and radiate it into the frozen air as fast as the stove could produce it. Old-timers said a Quonset hut in Alaska needed 15 cords to survive a winter. Some said 20. Walter had perhaps 4 months of hard work available before the ground froze. With his bad leg limiting him to half days of timber cutting, he could produce maybe 4 cords in that time. 4 cords, against a need for 15. The math was simple. The math said his family would freeze to death sometime in January. Gus Svensson ran the only general store within 30 miles. He'd come to Alaska during the gold rush of 1898 and stayed when the gold played out, trading prospectors' dreams for homesteaders' necessities. He'd seen 50 winters in the territory. He'd also seen what happened to families who weren't ready for them. Walter found him behind the counter on a June afternoon, the store smelling of kerosene and dried salmon, and the particular mustiness of a building that had stood for 40 years without adequate ventilation. "Korhonen," Svensson said, not looking up from his ledger. "The Finn with the metal house." "That's right." "And the bad leg." "That's right, too." Svensson finally raised his eyes. They were pale blue, nearly colorless, set in a face that looked like it had been carved from driftwood and left out in the weather. "I've been doing this a long time," he said. "You know what I've learned?" Walter waited. "The territory doesn't care how clever you are. It doesn't care about your plans or your determination or how much you love your family. It cares about one thing, whether you're ready, and you're not ready. I know the math." "Do you?" 8 cords minimum for that 10 you're building, more likely 12. You've got a woman and 2 small children, and a leg that won't let. You swing an axe more than half a day. You'll be lucky to put up 4 cords before freeze up." Svensson shook his head. "Every year someone comes up here with a clever idea. Every year I sell supplies to the rescue party that goes looking for the bodies." Walter felt his jaw tighten. "I didn't come here to die." "Nobody does." Svensson's voice held no cruelty, only the flat certainty of a man who'd seen the pattern repeat too many times. Go back to Michigan, Korhonen. Find work in a factory. Let your kids grow up with a father. The words hung in the air. Walter thought about Elsa, waiting at the homestead with the children. He thought about the truck payment still owed, the savings already spent, the letters he'd written to everyone back home about the new life they were building. He thought about the way Anna had looked at him when the truck broke down. "Papa, are we going to die out here?" "I'll need 20 pounds of flour," Walter said. 10 pounds of sugar, salt, coffee. Svensson stared at him for a long moment. Then he reached for his order pad. "I'll sell you what you need," the old man said. "But I'll be surprised if you're alive to pay your account come spring." The idea came to Walter 3 weeks later, in the unlikely setting of a dirt-floored trading post where he'd gone to buy nails. He was waiting for his order when an old man emerged from a structure half buried in the hillside behind the store. Asa Savusana, one of the Finnish smoke saunas Walter remembered from his childhood. But this one was different, dug into the earth rather than built upon it, with only the front wall and door visible above ground. The old man wore only a thin cotton shirt despite the morning chill. Steam rose from his skin. Walter found himself staring. The temperature had dropped into the 40s overnight. He'd been shivering in his jacket since dawn. "The sauna," Walter said, approaching. "How warm does it stay?" The old man, Finnish by his features and the lilting accent of his English, squinted at Walter appraisingly. "Warm enough. The earth holds heat. Dig down, build into the ground, and the cold can't reach you." He tapped the log wall beside him. "My father built like this in the old country. The ground is 50 degrees all winter. The air might be 50 below. Which would you rather have touching your walls?" Walter stood very still. 50 degrees. The ground stayed 50 degrees below the frost line, even when the air above plunged to 50 below. He learned that in the Seabees, building foundations in the Pacific. The Earth was a massive thermal battery, absorbing summer heat and releasing it slowly all winter. Dig deep enough, and the temperature barely changed from January to July. But Walter couldn't dig into the Earth. Not with his leg, not with his timeline, not with the muskeg that dominated half his claim, turning any excavation into a muddy nightmare. He couldn't build into the ground. But what if he could capture the ground's heat anyway? The thought hit him like a physical blow. In the Pacific, the Seabees had built structures on raised platforms, elevated floors that allowed air circulation beneath, keeping buildings cool in tropical heat. The same principle that brought cool air under a building in the tropics could be reversed in the cold. Raise the structure, but seal the space beneath it. Trap the Earth's warmth instead of letting it escape. His Quonset hut was going to sit on posts anyway, standard practice for temporary buildings. What if he enclosed that space, built walls around the crawl space, sealing it completely? The ground beneath would stay at 50 degrees. That warmth would rise through the floor instead of cold air circulating beneath. He wasn't building into the earth. He was building a container to catch what the earth gave off. The old Finn was watching him with curiosity. "You look like a man who's just seen something." "Maybe I have." Walter's mind was racing now. The crawl space would need to be sealed tight, no gaps for cold air to infiltrate. Stone would work. Stone was free, available in the creek bed. Stone was also thermal mass, storing heat during warm periods and releasing it when the cold hit hardest. A stone skirt around the base of his Quonset hut, 3 feet high, thick enough to seal the space beneath. The enclosed crawl space would capture the Earth's 50-degree warmth. The stone would add thermal mass to a structure that had none. The floor above would be heated from below, the most efficient direction since warm air rose. Instead of fighting the cold with fuel, he'd be fighting it with the ground itself. You're Korhonen, the old Finn said. The one building the metal house. That's right. I'm Aino Makinen. I've heard about you. A slight smile crossed his weathered face. I've heard you're going to freeze to death come winter. Maybe, Walter said, or maybe not. He explained his idea. Aino listened, his expression shifting from curiosity to interest to skepticism. The principle is sound, Aino admitted when Walter finished. My people have known this for centuries, but you're not building into the earth. You're building above it and hoping to capture the warmth. The heat will escape through your stone walls before it reaches your floor. Stone holds heat. It'll slow the loss. Maybe. And that metal shell, Aino gestured vaguely upward, indicating the curved walls of an imaginary Quonset hut. It will radiate cold into the space. You might make things worse, not better. But you're not saying it won't work. Aino was silent for a moment. I'm saying I don't know if it will work. That's not the same as saying it won't. He studied Walter's face. How much time do you have? 4 months before hard freeze, maybe less. And how much stone will you need? Walter had already calculated this on the walk over. The perimeter is about 136 feet, 3 foot. Walls, 18 inches thick, 15 tons of stone, maybe 18. Hauled by hand. I have a mule for the heavy loads. The rest, yes, by hand. And if it doesn't work? If my concerns are right and the heat escapes through the stone faster than the earth can replace it? Walter looked at the old man steadily. Then I'll have spent 2 months building a foundation for my family's grave. Aino was quiet for a long moment. Wind stirred the spruce tops. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. You're either going to succeed, Aino said finally, or you're going to die in an interesting way. He turned back toward his buried sauna. I'll be curious to find out which. Word spread. In a community of scattered homesteads and isolated trappers, news traveled slowly but thoroughly. By mid-July, everyone within 30 miles knew about the crazy Finn who was building a stone wall around his metal shed instead of cutting firewood like a sensible man. Opinions varied. Most people agreed with Gus Svensson. It was a death sentence with extra steps. A few, mostly other Finns and Scandinavians who remembered their grandparents' stories of earth-sheltered building, thought there might be something to it. But even they doubted it could be done in time, or done well enough to matter. Harlan Fitch wasn't interested in opinions. He was interested in business. Fitch ran the fuel supply operation in Kenai, firewood, coal, heating oil for those who could afford it. He'd built his livelihood on the simple fact that Alaska winters were cold and people needed heat. Every cord of wood he sold at $50 kept his family comfortable. Every desperate family who ran short in January and paid triple the summer price built his retirement stake. A homesteader who didn't need his firewood was a customer lost. Worse, if this crazy scheme actually worked, others might try it. Fitch could see his profits draining away into some fool's rock pile. He found Walter at the general store purchasing mortar supplies. Korhonen. Walter turned. He'd heard of Fitch but never met him, a thick-bodied man in his mid-40s with hands that looked like they'd spent decades handling heavy timber and a face that had settled into permanent displeasure. Mr. Fitch, I hear you're building some kind of rock wall around your tin can. Fitch moved closer, not quite blocking Walter's path, but making his presence felt. Instead of cutting firewood, like a sensible man would, that's right. You know what happens to families who run out of fuel in January? Fitch didn't wait for an answer. I've seen it. Found the Perkins family in 47. The children were still in their beds, frozen so hard we had to wait for spring to move them. Walter said nothing. He was aware of other customers in the store listening, of Gus Svensson watching from behind his counter. "You're going to kill those kids with your cleverness," Fitch continued. "And when you come crawling to me in December begging for firewood at triple price, I might just be too busy to help." The store had gone silent. Walter could feel the weight of every eye on him. He thought about arguing. He thought about explaining the physics of ground temperature, the principles of thermal mass, the calculations he'd run dozens of times. He thought about describing his CB training, the structures he'd built in conditions that would kill an unprepared man in hours. Instead, he picked up his bag of mortar and turned toward the door. "I'll be sure to send you a thank you note in spring," he said. He didn't look back to see Fitch's expression. He didn't need to. The silence told him enough. Outside, the July sun hung low over the inlet. 4 months until freeze up, 15 tons of stone to move, 136 feet of wall to build. And now, added to the weight of the work itself, the certainty that half the territory was waiting for him to fail. Walter climbed into his truck and started the engine. It caught on the third try. The fuel pump was holding, for now. As he pulled onto the road toward home, he passed the church where Elsa had taken the children for Sunday service. Later, she would tell him what the women had said, the whispers about whether Walter had been right in the head since the war, the sidelong glances at Anna and Eric, the children of a man everyone expected to be dead by February. Elsa didn't report these things to hurt him. She reported them because she believed in knowing the truth of a situation, even when the truth was ugly. "They think you're going to kill us," she said that night after the children were asleep. "I know." "Are you?" Walter looked at his wife. 4 years of marriage, 2 children, a journey of 4,000 miles to stand in this canvas tent on this piece of ground and ask this question. "I don't think so," he said. She nodded slowly. "Then we keep building." The work began before dawn and ended after dark. Walter fell into a rhythm that left no room for doubt, only motion, only the next stone, the next bucket of mortar, the next 6 inches of wall rising around the perimeter of his raised Quonset hut. The structure itself was already up, assembled in 3 days with help from a neighbor who owed him a favor. Its metal skin gleamed dully in the Alaska summer light, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel sitting on wooden posts 3 feet above the ground. Now came the real work. The creek bed offered an endless supply of fieldstone, rounded granite, and schist tumbled smooth by centuries of water. Each stone had to be evaluated, selected, hauled up the bank, loaded onto the mule-drawn sledge, transported to the building site, and fitted into place. The largest stones weighed over 100 pounds. The smallest were fist-sized, used to fill gaps between larger pieces. Walter could manage about 400 pounds of stone per hour in good conditions. His leg allowed him 4 or 5 hours of heavy work before the pain became disabling. That meant roughly 1.5 tons per day. In a best-case scenario, he needed 15 to 18 tons. At that rate, the wall would take 12 days of perfect labor. But there were no perfect days. There was rain that turned the creek bank to mud. There was a mule that went lame for 3 days and had to be rested. There was the endless, consuming work of simply staying alive, hunting, fishing, tending the garden Elsa had planted, hauling water, maintaining equipment, fixing the problems that arose daily in a homestead held together with improvisation and hope. By the end of the first week, the wall was 8% complete. At that rate, Walter would finish sometime in mid-October. The ground typically froze in early October. Mortar wouldn't cure after that. He did the math. He did it again. The numbers didn't change, so he stopped sleeping. Not entirely. He still got 4 hours a night, sometimes 5. But the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. became work hours, hauling stone by lantern light, when the midnight sun finally dipped below the horizon. His body protested, his legs screamed, he ignored both. Elsa joined him when she could, after the children were asleep. She couldn't lift the heavy stones, but she could mix mortar, sort stones by size, and spot the sledge while Walter loaded. 7-year-old Anna started helping after breakfast, carrying rocks too small for the wall but perfect for filling interior gaps. Even Eric, barely 4, found ways to contribute, bringing water, collecting clay from the creek bank for mortar. The Koronins worked. And slowly, inch by inch, the wall rose. By the end of the 3rd week, they had completed 30% of the perimeter. Walter's hands were a landscape of cracked calluses and blood blisters. 2 fingernails had gone black from dropped stones. He'd lost 8 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. His pants now required a rope belt to stay up, but the wall was rising. 16 inches thick at the base, tapering slightly as it climbed. Double wall construction, 2 rows of larger stones with smaller harding stones filling the interior gaps. Mortar packed into every crevice, sealing the structure against the wind that would try to infiltrate. Then the posts failed. Walter was fitting a capstone into place when he noticed the lean, a slight but unmistakable tilt in the Quonset hut's northwest corner. He checked the post and found it soft, spongy, with rot that shouldn't have been there. The wood had looked sound when he'd cut it in June, but something in the grain had hidden the decay, and now, under the weight of the structure, it was beginning to give way. 2 posts, maybe 3. He wouldn't know until he jacked up the corner and checked each one. 3 days. 3 days to cut new posts, haul them to the site, jack up the structure, replace the damaged supports, and resume work on the wall. 3 days he didn't have. Walter stood in the August twilight and stared at the tilting corner of his Quonset hut. The wall was 30% complete. The ground would freeze in roughly 8 weeks. Even without this setback, the timeline was marginal. With it, the math finally became impossible. He was going to fail, not from lack of will or lack of effort, but from simple arithmetic. There weren't enough hours in the day. Aino Makinen appeared on a morning in early September when the wall stood at 62% and Walter had begun to accept that he wouldn't finish in time. The old Finn brought his 2 grown sons and a sledge loaded with dressed stone, perhaps 400 pounds of it, cut flat for easy stacking. Walter watched them approach from where he knelt beside the wall, mortar bucket in one hand, trowel in the other. He'd been working since 4 a.m. His leg had gone numb 2 hours ago, which was actually a relief. At least it had stopped hurting. Makinen. Korhonen. Aino surveyed the wall, the Quonset hut, the scattered tools and depleted stone pile. You're behind schedule. I know. You're not going to finish. I know. Aino nodded slowly. His son stood behind him, waiting. I've been thinking about what you said, about capturing the Earth's heat without digging into it. He ran a hand along the top course of stones. It's not how my people did it, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Walter waited. I want my boys to understand what you're trying to do here, Aino said. If it works, I want them to know how. That's worth a day's labor to me. He paused. Maybe 2 days. The offer hung in the air. It wasn't charity. Aino had framed it as a trade, knowledge for labor, but they both knew the truth. Aino didn't believe the system would work. He'd come to help a man avoid killing his family, and he'd found a way to do it that let Walter keep his pride. Walter's throat tightened. He'd been alone with this for so long, alone against the math, alone against the skeptics, alone against the territory itself. And now this old man he barely knew was offering 3 days of skilled labor because he couldn't stand to watch another family die. I'll take that trade, Walter said. Eno's sons were named Toivo and Paavo. They worked without complaint, hauling stone at nearly twice Walter's pace and fitting it with a precision that spoke of generations of Finnish craftsmanship. In 3 days, they advanced the wall from 62% to 87%. On the last evening, as the sons loaded their tools onto the sledge, Ino stood beside Walter and looked at the nearly complete structure. "I still don't know if it will work," the old man admitted. "The principle is sound, but the execution—" He shook his head. "You're asking stone to do what earth does. Stone is harder, colder. It may not hold the warmth the way ground does." "It's the best I can do?" Ino nodded. "Then I hope it's good enough." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. That metal roof. You need something between the steel and the living space. Anything. Old blankets, moss, newspapers. The steel will radiate cold downward. If you don't buffer it, you'll lose everything the crawl space gives you. I've been collecting moss from the muskeg, and we have some old army blankets." "Good." Aino clasped Walter's hand. "I'll be curious to see what your thermometers say in January." Walter watched them go, the sledge disappearing down the track toward Aino's homestead. Then he turned back to the wall. 13% to go. Perhaps 500 more stones. A week of work, if the weather held. The first hard frost was due any day. On the last day of September, Walter placed the final stone. The wall stood 3 feet high, running the entire perimeter of the raised Quonset hut. 136 linear feet of double-wall stone construction, mortared and chinked against the wind. The crawl space beneath the building was now sealed, a cave of captured air between the earth and the floor above. Walter had rigged thermometers in 3 locations: outside, inside the crawl space, accessible through a small hatch he'd built into the stone, and on the floor of the living area. The instruments were simple mercury columns, but they would tell him what he needed to know. On that final day of September, the readings were: outside air, 34 degrees, crawl space, 49 degrees, floor surface, 44 degrees. The crawl space was 15 degrees warmer than the outside air. The floor was 10 degrees warmer. It was working. In the mildest possible conditions, with the season still on the edge of fall, the system was working. But Gus Svensson's words echoed in Walter's mind. "You haven't seen real cold yet. 34 degrees was nothing. A cool night in Michigan. The true test would come when the temperature dropped past 0, past 20 below, into the killing cold of deep winter. Then he would know whether the earth's heat could flow through stone and save his family, or whether he had built, as Svensson predicted, a tin can coffin with decorative rocks around the base. The first snow fell 2 days later. By mid-October, the world had turned white, and the temperature had plunged to 18 below. Walter checked his thermometers every morning. Outside air, 18 below 0. Crawl space, 41 degrees. Floor surface, 36 degrees. A differential of 59 degrees between the outside air and the crawl space. The stone was holding. The earth was giving up its warmth. But the old-timers were talking. They'd been watching the signs, the early migration of the geese, the poor berry crop, the way the ice was forming on the inlet weeks ahead of schedule. They said this winter would be the coldest in a decade, and it was still October. Walter added another layer of moss insulation to the interior ceiling, stuffing the gaps between the curved steel and the wooden frame Elsa had helped him build. He cut what firewood he could on the mild days, adding another quarter cord to his stockpile. He reinforced the stone wall at the north end, where the wind hit hardest, and he waited. On the night of November 7th, the temperature dropped to 22 below zero. The system held. Crawl space at 41 degrees, floor at 36, interior of the Quonset hut at 55 degrees with careful stove management. Better than he'd hoped. Not good enough, said the voice in his head that sounded like Gus Svensson. Not nearly good enough. The storm came in January. It started as weather always started in Alaska, a change in the wind, a shift in the clouds, a feeling in the air that something was building beyond the mountains. Walter had learned to read these signs in his months on the homestead, but this one was different. This one felt heavy. This one felt hungry. On the morning of January 14th, the temperature was 18 below zero and dropping. By nightfall, it had reached 34 below. Walter checked his thermometers with hands that shook from cold despite his heavy gloves. Crawl space, 39 degrees. Floor, 32. The system was working, but he could feel it straining. The stone walls were cold to the touch for the first time since he'd built them. Heat was leaking out faster than the earth could replace it. He added wood to the stove. Checked the children. Checked the thermometers again. Outside, 34 below. Crawl space, 39. Floor, 32. Anna was coughing. She'd had a cold for 3 days. Nothing unusual. Nothing that had worried Elsa. But tonight the cough was deeper, wetter. When Walter touched his daughter's forehead, the heat there had nothing to do with the stove. "She's burning up," Elsa said quietly. The nearest doctor was in Anchorage, 70 miles by summer road, longer in winter conditions, and right now the temperature outside would freeze exposed skin in minutes. They couldn't travel. They couldn't signal for help. They couldn't do anything except keep Anna warm and hope her body fought off whatever had taken hold, and the temperature was still dropping. By midnight, the outside thermometer read 47 below zero. Ice fog had swallowed the world, water vapor frozen into crystals that hung in the air like a curtain, reducing visibility to 50 feet. The stove roared. The walls creaked. Walter checked the crawl space. 36 degrees, still holding. The earth was still giving up its warmth, still pushing 50-degree air into the sealed space beneath his floor. But the differential was shrinking. At this rate, by morning, he stopped the calculation. There was no point. He would know by morning what the numbers were. For now, there was only the next hour, the next log on the fire, the next check on Anna's fever. Elsa sat by their daughter's bed, spooning broth between pale lips. Eric had fallen asleep hours ago, exhausted by the fear he didn't understand. The stove filled the Quonset hut with warmth that felt increasingly precarious, a bubble of life in a world that wanted them dead. Outside, the temperature dropped past 50 below. Chunk 2 continues. The thermometer outside read 52 degrees below zero. Walter had stopped checking it every hour. The numbers had become almost meaningless, abstractions that couldn't capture what 52 below actually meant. It meant the air itself had become an enemy, so cold it burned exposed skin in seconds. It meant the trees in the forest were exploding, their frozen sap expanding until the trunks cracked like rifle shots. It meant that somewhere out there, beyond the ice fog that had swallowed the world, people were dying. Inside the Quonset hut, the floor-level temperature held at 38 degrees, 90 degrees of difference. Between the killing cold outside and the cold but survivable air near his children's beds, 90 degrees, Walter knelt beside Anna's cot and touched her forehead, still burning. The fever had peaked sometime around 3 in the morning, her small body shaking with chills even as heat radiated from her skin. Elsa had been spooning water between her lips all night, keeping her hydrated, keeping her fighting. "How is she?" Walter's voice came out as a croak. He'd been awake for 36 hours. The same. Elsa looked up and Walter saw the exhaustion carved into her face. Maybe a little better. The shaking stopped an hour ago. That was something. The shaking stopping meant the fever might be breaking, or it meant her body was giving up the fight. There was no way to know which without a doctor, and the doctor was 70 miles away through air that would freeze a man's lungs in 3 breaths. Walter checked the crawl space thermometer through the floor hatch. 34 degrees. Down from 41 at the start of the cold snap, but holding. The earth was still pushing its warmth into the sealed space beneath them, still fighting against the cold that pressed in from every direction. He did the math one more time. At current burn rate, they were going through perhaps a fifth of a cord per day. The cold snap had already consumed 3/5 of a cord in 3 days. If it lasted another week, but it wouldn't last another week. It couldn't. Even Alaska had limits. Outside, the temperature dropped to 54 below. On the morning of the 4th day, Walter heard the sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It started as a distant cracking, like ice breaking on the inlet, but it was too rhythmic for ice, too deliberate. It took him a moment to realize what he was hearing. Footsteps. Someone was walking through the frozen forest toward his homestead. He pulled on every layer of clothing he owned and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical assault. His first breath seared his lungs. His eyes watered instantly, the tears freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. Through the ice fog, visibility was perhaps 40 feet. A shape emerged from the white. Tom Hendricks, Walter's nearest neighbor, wrapped in so many furs he looked barely human. His face was covered except for his eyes, and even those were nearly hidden behind frost-covered lashes. Korhonen. The word came out muffled through the fur. Hendricks, what are you doing out here? Checking on you. Tom's eyes moved to the Quonset hut, to the stone wall surrounding its base. We saw your smoke. Figured if you were still burning, you were still alive. We're alive. How? The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely bewildered. How are you still alive? Walter understood the question. Tom had built a proper log cabin, well chinked and insulated. He'd cut 8 cords of firewood before winter. He'd done everything right, everything the old-timers recommended, and he was struggling. The floor, Tom continued. Our floor is frozen solid. The children are sleeping on raised platforms near the ceiling because that's the only place warm enough. We're burning through wood so fast I thought about... He stopped. Thought about what? Tom's eyes dropped. I tried to make it to Svensson's store yesterday. For more wood. I made it about a mile before I couldn't feel my hands anymore. Had to turn back. He held up his mittens. Frostbite. Both hands. I can barely grip an axe now. Walter felt his stomach clench. Tom Hendricks was a strong man, experienced, prepared. If the cold had nearly killed him trying to reach supplies, what was happening to families who were less prepared? What about the young couple from Oregon who'd homesteaded north of the inlet? What about the old widower who lived alone near the head of the creek? Come inside, Walter said. Warm up before you head back. Tom shook his head. I need to get home. Martha's alone with the children. But he didn't move. He stood staring at the Quonset hut, at the stone skirt that everyone had mocked, at the chimney smoke that proved the impossible. A family surviving in a metal shed during the coldest weather in a decade. Korhonen, what did you do? Walter looked at the stone wall, at the work that had nearly killed him, at the desperate gamble that everyone said would fail. I caught the heat that comes out of the ground, he said. Instead of fighting the cold with fire, I fought it with the earth. Tom stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, He turned and disappeared back into the ice fog. Anna's fever broke on the 5th day. She opened her eyes in the gray light of an Alaska winter morning and asked for food. Not water, not comfort, food. The first clear sign that her body was winning the fight. Elsa wept, silent tears that she tried to hide, bending over the stove to prepare broth as if that were the reason her shoulders were shaking. Walter sat beside his daughter's cot and held her hand and felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight for 4 days. Outside, the temperature had risen to 44 below, still deadly, still dangerous. But the worst had passed. Walter checked his thermometers one final time. Outside air, 44 below zero. Crawl space, 34 degrees. Floor surface, 28 degrees. Interior at floor level, 38 degrees. Interior at head height, 62 degrees. The numbers told a story. At floor level, where his children slept, the air was 82 degrees warmer than the killing cold outside. At head height, the differential was over 100 degrees. The sealed crawl space had stayed above freezing throughout the entire cold snap, the Earth's 50-degree warmth pushing up through stone and wood to fight against the Arctic air. He calculated their fuel consumption, 4/5 of a cord over 5 days. At that rate, they would finish winter with nearly 1.5 cords to spare. A conventional cabin would have burned 2.5 cords in the same period, maybe more, given the extreme temperatures. The Hendricks family, in their proper log cabin, had probably gone through 3 cords. That was the difference between surviving and not surviving. Between reaching spring with reserves and running out in February. The system had worked. Not just worked, it had exceeded every expectation. Walter had hoped for a 60-degree differential during extreme cold. He'd achieved 90. He'd hoped to cut fuel consumption in half. He'd cut it by 2/3. The ground had given up its heat, just as old Aino had said the Finns had known for centuries. The stone had held that heat, releasing it slowly as the cold pressed in. The sealed crawl space had created a buffer of warm air beneath the floor, lifting the temperature of the entire structure. His tin can coffin had become a warm refuge in a world of ice. On the 6th day, when the temperature rose to 15 below, Walter stepped outside to survey the damage. The world was white and silent. Trees stood like skeletons, their branches heavy with frost. The ice fog had lifted enough to see across the clearing to the edge of the forest, but beyond that, everything dissolved into gray. His woodpile stood where he'd left it, covered in snow but intact. The stone wall showed no damage, not a single shifted stone, not a crack in the mortar. The Quonset hut's metal skin was crusted with ice on the outside, but the structure itself had weathered the storm. He thought about Tom Hendricks trudging back to his cabin with frostbitten hands. He thought about the other families scattered across the Kenai Peninsula, burning through their winter reserves in a desperate fight against cold that would last another 3 months. And he thought about what he knew now that he hadn't known in September. It worked. The theory he'd built from an old Finn sauna and his own military training. The crazy idea that everyone had mocked. It worked. The question was what to do with that knowledge. 3 weeks after the cold snap broke, Gus Svensson made the difficult journey to Walter's homestead. The old man arrived on a dog sled, his breath pluming in the 20 below air. Walter saw him coming across the clearing and went out to meet him, already knowing why he was there. Word had spread. It always did. Svensson climbed off the sled slowly, his movement stiff with age and cold. He stood looking at the Quonset hut, at the stone wall, at the thermometer Walter had nailed to a post outside the door. "Temperature logs," Svensson said finally. "I want to see your temperature logs." Walter led him inside. He'd kept meticulous records since October, daily readings of outside temperature, crawl space temperature, floor temperature, and interior temperature at 2 heights. The logs filled a notebook, page after page of numbers, that told the story of a winter survived. Svensson sat at the small table and read through the logs in silence. His finger traced the columns, pausing at the readings from the cold snap. Outside, -52. Crawl space, 34. Floor, 28. Interior floor level, 38. He read the fuel consumption estimates, compared them to the conventional requirements he knew by heart from 50 years in the territory. When he finished, he sat very still for a long moment. "I've been in Alaska since '98, he said slowly. "I've seen a lot of men try to outsmart the cold. Clever men, determined men. Most of them are dead." Walter waited. Svensson looked up. His pale eyes, which had held only skepticism at their first meeting, now held something else, something like respect. "I told you this wouldn't work. I told you you'd be dead by spring." He tapped the notebook. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air. Gus Svensson admitting error. Gus Svensson, who'd been right about the territory longer than Walter had been alive. "You understand what you've done. Here?" The old man stood and walked to the corner where Walter had installed the floor hatch, the access point to the crawl space. He knelt, opened it, and held his hand in the opening for a moment. "You're not just heating different, you're heating smarter. I've seen men burn 10 cords a winter, keeping a cabin half this size, half this warm. You burned 3. 3.5, Walter corrected. "We're still burning." Svensson almost smiled. 3.5 cords to make it through the worst winter in a decade, in a building everyone said would be your tomb. He closed the hatch and stood. "Tom Hendricks was in my store yesterday. He wants to know if you'll explain your design to him. He wants to retrofit his cabin next summer, partial stone skirt, sealed crawl space. I'll show him. I thought you might." Svensson moved toward the door, then paused. "The Perkins family. The ones Harlan Fitch mentioned. The ones who froze in '47. Walter nodded. "They had a good cabin. Proper logs, well chinked. They ran out of wood in February, and no one could reach them in time." Svensson's voice was quiet. "I think about them sometimes. What if they'd known what you know? What if someone had told them there was another way?" He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped outside, climbed onto his dog sled, and disappeared into the white. The visitors started coming in late February. Tom Hendricks was first, his frostbitten hands still bandaged but healing. He spent an entire day with Walter, studying the stone wall, measuring the crawl space, taking notes in a small leather book he'd brought for the purpose. "The heat really comes from the ground?" he asked for the third time, as if he still couldn't quite believe it. 50 degrees all winter, 4 feet down. It doesn't matter if the air is 50 below. The earth holds its temperature. "And the stone catches it?" "The stone seals the space, keeps the warm air from escaping, keeps the cold air from getting in. The stone also stores heat, releases it slowly when the cold hits hardest." Tom shook his head. All those years cutting wood, all those winters freezing on the floor, and the answer was right under our feet the whole time. A week later, a young couple came, the Morrisons, who'd been planning to homestead north of the inlet. They'd heard about Walter's system and wanted to understand it before they built. "Everyone said you were crazy," said the young husband, Peter Morrison. "Everyone said you'd freeze." "Everyone was wrong." "How did you know? How did you know it would work?" Walter thought about that, about the old Finnish trapper and his half-buried sauna, about the CB construction manuals and the raised platforms of the Pacific, about the desperate math that had left him no choice but to try something different. "I didn't know," he admitted. I hoped. I calculated. I built the best I could with what I understood, and then I waited to find out if I was right or dead. The Morrisons exchanged a look. Walter recognized it, the look of people deciding whether to gamble everything on an uncertain outcome. We'll do it, Peter said. We'll build like you built. I'll help you, Walter said. We'll get it right. Aino Makinen returned in March, when the days had begun to lengthen and the worst of the cold was behind them. He brought his notebook again, the one filled with Finnish building techniques passed down through generations. But this time, he also brought a camera. I want to photograph your wall, he explained, your floor, the crawl space. I want to document what you've done. Why? Because you've done something my people knew but couldn't finish. Aino ran his hand along the stone, feeling its cold surface. We knew the earth held warmth. We knew to build into the ground, but we never figured out how to catch the ground's heat without digging. You did. I just combined what I knew. That's what innovation is. Aino pulled out his camera. My father would have understood what you built here. He would have called it a different kind of malmaja, an earth house that sits above the earth instead of inside it. He photographed the wall from every angle. He measured the crawl space, calculated the volume, estimated the thermal mass of the stone. He asked Walter to explain his reasoning, his calculations, his process. I'm going to write this down, Aino said when he finished. I'm going to send it to my cousins in Finland, maybe to the university in Helsinki. This should be known. It's not that complicated. No, Aino agreed. It's not. That's what makes it important. It's simple enough that anyone can do it if they know it's possible. Harlan Fitch never came to see Walter's homestead. He never admitted he was wrong. But in late March, when Walter went to Svensson's store for supplies, he found Fitch behind the counter, helping Gus with inventory. Their eyes met. Walter nodded. Fitch nodded. Back. That was all. But Walter noticed something as he shopped. The firewood stacked outside Fitch's truck, meant for delivery to homesteaders running low, sat untouched. Word had spread about Walter's system. Word had spread about how Tom Hendricks had survived the cold snap with his retrofitted crawl space. Word had spread that there might be another way to heat a home in Alaska, a way that didn't require selling your soul to the fuel merchant. Fitch's customer base was shrinking. Not dramatically, not yet. But the whispers had started, and whispers in a small community became conversations, and conversations became changed behavior. On his way out of the store, Walter paused beside Fitch's truck. I never wished you any harm, Walter said. I just wanted my family to live. Fitch was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice held no warmth, but no hostility either, just a kind of tired acceptance. You did what you had to do. I understand that. He turned away. Doesn't mean I have to like it. Walter supposed that was as much acknowledgement as he would ever get from Harlan Fitch. It was enough. The snow melted in late April. The creek swelled with runoff. The muskeg turned to mud, and the world that had been frozen solid for 7 months slowly, grudgingly, came back to life. Walter stood outside his Quonset hut on the first day warm enough to go without a jacket and looked at what he'd built. The metal walls gleamed in the spring sun, their corrugated surface still marked by the frost patterns of 100 frozen nights. The stone skirt had survived the winter without a single crack, the mortar intact, the field stones locked together as tightly as the day he'd placed them. Inside, Elsa was singing. Anna and Eric were playing some game that involved a great deal of running and shouting, the sounds of a family alive, healthy, safe. 1 cord of firewood remained in the stack, 1 full cord they'd never needed to burn. Walter thought about the people who told him he would fail. Gus Svensson, who'd predicted bodies. Harlan Fitch, who'd wished him failure. Aino Makinen, who doubted the execution even as he understood the principle. The women at church who'd whispered about his sanity. They'd all been wrong, but they hadn't been wrong to doubt. The idea had been unproven, the timeline impossible, the math brutal. Walter had succeeded not because the skeptics were fools, but because sometimes the desperate gamble pays off. Sometimes the crazy idea works, and sometimes, if you're lucky and stubborn enough, you get to be the one who proves it. Walter Koronin lived on that homestead for 27 more years. He refined his design with each passing winter, adding improvements that further reduced fuel consumption. Interior insulation, improved ventilation, a root cellar that extended the sealed crawl space deeper into the ground. By the late 1950s, his Quonset hut stayed comfortable through the worst cold on barely 2 cords of firewood per year. Elsa died in 1976, carried off by a cancer that no amount of innovative building could defeat. Walter stayed on alone for 3 more years, unwilling to leave the place they'd built together. When he finally sold the homestead in 1979, he asked only that the new owners keep the stone wall intact. "That's the heart of it," he told them. "The rest you can change, but keep the wall." They did. Anna grew up to become a teacher in Anchorage, eventually serving as principal of a school that bore her name. Eric ran fishing boats out of Kenai for 40 years, raising 3 children who never knew a winter without central heating. Walter died in 1989, at the age of 72, in a hospital room far from the homestead where he'd expected to spend his final days. His last request was to have his ashes scattered at the creek where he'd gathered the stones. Anna honored that request on a September morning, much like the ones Walter had described to her 1,000 times, the birches turning gold, the creek running cold and clear, the first frost whitening the muskeg. She stood at the water's edge and thought about what her father had built. Not just the stone wall, not just the sealed crawl space, but the idea itself. The understanding that survival sometimes meant thinking differently, that the answer to an impossible problem might be right beneath your feet, waiting to be discovered. The ashes caught the wind and disappeared into the water, carried downstream toward the inlet, toward the ocean, toward the larger world that had never heard of Walter Korhonen and his crazy rock wall. But the wall remained. By the 1960s, Korhonen-style construction had become a term of art among Alaska homesteaders. Not everyone who used it knew where the name came from. It had simply entered the vocabulary, the way practical knowledge does through repetition, adaptation, and the slow erosion of origin. The technique spread and evolved. Some builders used concrete instead of stone. Others used insulated panels instead of masonry. The core principle remained the same: seal the space beneath a raised structure, capture the Earth's constant warmth, fight the cold with physics instead of fuel. In 1977, the University of Minnesota established the Underground Space Center, dedicating academic resources to the study of Earth-sheltered construction. Their research confirmed what Walter had discovered by necessity. Below the frost line, the ground maintains a stable temperature of roughly 50 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. Their first publication on the subject sold 160,000 copies. Their findings validated techniques that homesteaders had been using for generations. The scientists didn't know about Walter Korhonen. They didn't know about the Finnish trappers who'd built half-buried saunas, or the Seabees who'd raised platforms in the Pacific, or the desperate calculations of a man with a bad leg and 2 small children. They discovered the same principles through controlled experiments and peer-reviewed methodology. That's how knowledge often works. It gets discovered, forgotten, rediscovered, formalized. The path from practical survival to academic validation is rarely straight, and the original discoverers are rarely credited. But the Earth doesn't care about credit. It just holds on to its warmth, waiting for someone to catch it. In January of 2024, during a cold snap that dropped temperatures across the Kenai Peninsula to 48 below zero, a homesteader named Daniel Crow checked the thermometer inside his sealed crawl space. 44 degrees. Outside, the wind was howling, driving the temperature down toward numbers that would have terrified Daniel's grandparents. Inside his modern cabin, built on posts with insulated skirting and vapor barriers, the floor stayed comfortable. His heating bill for the month would be a fraction of what his neighbors paid. Daniel didn't know about Walter Korhonen. He'd never heard the name, never read the story. He'd built his cabin based on advice from a contractor who'd learned the technique from an old-timer who'd learned it from someone else, a chain of knowledge stretching back through decades of adaptation and refinement. The cabin sat about 12 miles from where Walter's homestead had been. The original Quonset hut was gone now, replaced by a modern structure sometime in the 80s. But if Daniel had known where to look, if he'd walked the property carefully, he might have found a stone foundation buried in the undergrowth, field stones hauled from a creek bed, fitted with aching precision by a man who'd been told he was going to die. The stones were still there, locked together by mortar that had survived 70 winters. The earth beneath them still held its 50-degree warmth, still pushing heat toward the surface, still doing what the earth had always done. Walter Korhonen had asked the new owners to keep the wall. They had, even when they tore down the Quonset hut, even when they built their modern cabin on a different part of the lot. The wall had become a kind of monument, though no one remembered exactly what it commemorated. Some knowledge survives through documentation, some survives through repetition, and some survives through stone, the patient work of hands that understood what they were building, even if they couldn't be certain it would work. The Kenai Peninsula in winter is a place of terrible beauty. The mountains rise white against a sky so blue it hurts to look at. The inlet freezes and thaws and freezes again, a gray expanse of ice and open water. The forests stand silent under their burden of snow, waiting for the spring that seems impossibly far away. Temperatures drop to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The cold doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about plans or determination or love. It simply is a fact of physics, a challenge that must be met with adequate preparation or not at all. For more than a century, people have come to this place to build new lives. Some have succeeded. Many have failed. The territory has always been honest about the bargain it offers. Stay, and you might find something worth the struggle. Leave, and no one will blame you. Walter Korhonen came to the Kenai Peninsula in 1951 with a bad leg, a surplus metal building, and an idea that everyone said would kill him. He stayed for 28 years. He raised 2 children to adulthood. He buried his wife in ground that had sustained them both. He figured out something important about the relationship between earth and air, between desperation and innovation, between what everyone knows and what might actually be true. The idea he proved wasn't complicated. The ground is warm. The air is cold. If you can catch the ground's warmth before the air steals it, you can survive in places that should kill you. Simple. Obvious in retrospect. Revolutionary to the people who'd never thought of it. That's how most important discoveries work. They seem inevitable only after someone proves they're possible. The stone wall still stands. It sits on a piece of property that has changed hands 3 times since Walter's death, now owned by a family from Oregon who use it as a summer cabin. They don't know its history. They think of it as a quaint relic, a decorative foundation left over from some earlier structure. But if you knelt beside that wall on a January night, when the temperature had dropped to 50 below and the stars blazed with the cold light of deep space, you would feel something remarkable. You would feel warmth rising from the stones. Not much, a few degrees, a subtle difference between the frozen air and the patient heat of the earth. But enough. Enough to notice. Enough to survive on if you knew how to catch it. The earth holds its warmth. It always has. It always will. Walter Korhonen didn't invent that fact. He just figured out how to use it in a desperate time with a family depending on him and no margin for error. Somewhere in that wall, between the field stones he hauled from the creek and the mortar he mixed by hand, there's a piece of that desperation preserved, a record of what it meant to face an impossible problem and find an answer no one believed in. The wall doesn't tell its story to visitors. It just stands there holding onto warmth, waiting for someone to notice. Most people walk right past. But the heat is still there, still rising from the earth, still fighting the cold the way it fought the cold 70 years ago, when a man with a bad leg and 2 small children decided he wasn't going to die in a metal shed in Alaska. He was going to catch the heat that came out of the ground. And he did.